Okay, if you would turn in your Bibles to the pastoral epistles. So in other words, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. And we're going to treat these as a block of literature. So we won't be looking at them as far as distinction from one another. I'm going to call them all the pastoral epistles. We're going to kind of look at some familiar or some overlap in topics that they all share. So we're going to really treat them as one big letter in some ways. Except for in the background material, I'll try to make a few distinctions here. But what's interesting is that the problems that we have with the pastoral epistles, in other words, knowing when they were written, and knowing sometimes even, we know to whom they were written, but knowing to where that person was geographically, these are some open-ended questions that we just don't have a whole lot of information on. So it kind of helps to treat them as a unit here. So background context. Paul is our sole author here for all three letters, and the audience is individuals. And so when we talk about Paul's letter collection, Romans, all the way down here to Titus, we see here that Paul starts, or at least the letter collection is arranged starting, Paul is writing to churches. So groups of people in Rome, groups of people in Corinth. But then these last three letters are actually written to individuals. So we have Timothy and Titus. 1 Timothy is written to Timothy while he ministers to the churches in Ephesus. So there's some detail in the book that actually lets us know where Timothy's at. 2 Timothy, we're not sure where Timothy's at here, right? So presumably all of these letters are written in very close chronological order, time, proximity to one another, but we're not sure where Timothy is at here. And Titus is written to Titus while he is serving and ministering in the churches in Crete. So this kind of raises a question: when did churches in Crete get planted? Or are they Pauline churches? Or did Titus get sent there? And these are where the open-ended questions kind of come from. It's difficult to slot when the pastorals were written based on Paul's missionary trips in the book of Acts. So the rest of Paul's letters, we can actually, have some kind of good idea of when the letters were written, or at least when Paul planted a church there and then wrote the letters afterwards. We can kind of come up with some good data for that. But the pastoral epistles, we really just don't have a good time frame for when Paul may have written these. It could have been when after the details of Acts, in other words, where Paul has been arrested at Acts, in Acts. He's under house arrest for a number of years. He ends up going to Rome. And then presumably he's released, maybe goes to Spain. We know that that's his intention because of his letter to the Romans. And then maybe when he comes back is when he actually does this kind of Mediterranean Crete church planting trip, or at least maybe he's writing the pastoral letters. We just really don't know. There's a gap in our information here. We can see a little bit about where these are at, right? So Ephesus we're familiar with by now. Paul not only went there on 2 separate missionary trips, but we know that he spent extended time there, like several years there, and that he also wrote a letter to them. And now Timothy is working there, at least in 1 Timothy. And then here we have Crete, where Titus is planting churches at. So the date. Well, maybe I should put date in quotes here because we don't actually have a date. We don't know. We can kind of relatively discern an order. In other words, and this is not intended to be funny, even though it's kind of like Bible humor. It's not funny, but it could be funny. 1 Timothy comes first. Like, that's about the best we can do, right? 2 Timothy comes after 1 Timothy. But even more so than the titles, generally speaking, we understand that the content of 1 Timothy came before the content of 2 Timothy, right? And so it's not just a matter of their numbers, 1 and 2. And then maybe Titus was written in between there. The reason being is because 2 Timothy is often understood as Paul's last letter where he's under arrest again. He's in prison. And so it's not looking like, or at least he's kind of communicating that he's not going to survive this, that he's not going to be freed. And so he wants Timothy to come visit him before his execution, right? So with 2 Timothy, we kind of see Paul's final thoughts, his final exhortations to Timothy before he dies. Once again, there's some guesswork going on here, so that's why we don't have any numbers some actual dates I can give you there. Well, the purpose statements. Thankfully, these are relatively clear. 1 Timothy, Paul writes to exhort Timothy to correct false teaching, to establish church leaders, and to address the various needs of the churches, of the congregations. So we see here that Paul unpacks a little bit about what church leadership will look like. We've had elders being referred to in other books. We've had pastors, teachers, evangelists, prophets. These are terms that have been used in Paul's other letters, but we're given in 1 Timothy and Titus a bit more of a structure, a hierarchy of how churches are to function locally. 2 Timothy, Paul is in prison. So we're just kind of doing these in book order here. Paul is in prison in Rome. We can see this from 2 Timothy chapter 1, and he expects to die soon. At the end of the book, we can see this, chapter 4. And so he writes to exhort Timothy to disciple and train faithful men, to be future leaders, and to invite him to his side before he presumably dies. And then for Titus, Paul writes Titus to exhort Titus to establish elders in Crete and to rebuke false teachers and to model and establish discipleship among the believers. So we see a couple of overlapping themes here. For one, Paul's concern for false teachers, right? That kind of sifts to the top here. Another, Paul's desire for the churches to have good leaders and what that looks like. What does it mean to have a good leader? Is this just kind of a role or a position that anyone should seek? Or are there qualifications? Do we need certain gifting? How does that work together in a local church? Paul unpacks that a bit for us. And then, of course, Paul has an emphasis here on training up the next generation. So he is passing that baton on as well to, hey, let's keep moving forward here, making sure discipleship is a significant part of raising up the next generation of leaders for us. As far as composition and structure goes, I think in your notes I just have a bunch of question marks because the composition or the structure of these letters can be kind of difficult. So I'm still working through a good outline for that, so we won't hold you to that at all. So maybe if you have a question like, where does the pastoral letters fit with the book of Acts? That's a good question. I don't know. It doesn't seem to fit real well with the book of Acts, right? Maybe it was written after the details of Acts were recorded, or maybe I should say it this way, the narrative of Acts, where it ends, doesn't really account for Paul's pastoral letters, the ministry there. So maybe Paul wrote them after he went on his mission trip to Spain, after he got out of under his first long-term arrest. And so we see here that Paul's arrested again, and it seems like he's expecting to be executed. So we'll add the pastoral bundle to our mailbox here and look at a couple of literary characteristics. Now, one of the things that's really helpful about the pastoral epistles is we get some content here where Paul says, hey, this is a worthy statement, or this is a trustworthy statement. In other words, he almost seems to be pulling some wisdom out here and saying, hey, here's like something you could put on a plaque in your office to kind of build your ministry around some of these things. Now, remember, he's writing to presumably young men, Timothy and Titus, and he recognizes that they're the next generation to carry on the gospel proclamation and planting churches. And so he's wanting to leave them with the nuggets of wisdom and training. He's already discipled them. They've already been ministers together. But now he's kind of leaving them, hey, when I'm gone, these are the things that you need to be thinking about as you raise up the next generation. So the pastorals are written to younger individuals, instructing them in how to shepherd the body of Christ. And so we see here that both of these men, particularly Titus, we have a command really to the congregation. Don't let them despise you because of your youth. So when you think about that, wow, that kind of lets us know that Titus in particular is working amongst people who predominantly may be older than him. And so he's having to give direction and admonish and teach and challenge and rebuke and all of these things that socially that would be very uncomfortable, not only in the ancient world, but that would be socially uncomfortable even today, right, with our modern social sensitivities. Big letter B, 1 Timothy contains several trustworthy statements. This is what I was talking about earlier. If you go to 1 Timothy chapter 1, let's look at one of these here. Verse 15, Paul says, the saying is trustworthy and deserving of full acceptance, that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the foremost. And then if you go to chapter 3 here, verse 1, Paul says, the saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, or I believe those are synonymous with elder, then he desires a noble task. So in other words, it's a good thing to want to be an elder, an overseer. Look at chapter 4, verse 9. Paul says, the saying is trustworthy and deserving of full acceptance, right? So if we were to go back above this, verse 8, for while bodily training is of some value, godliness is of value in every way, as it holds promise for the present life and also for the life to come. So we can see here that Paul is giving these little snippets of wisdom upon which Timothy and Titus are supposed to kind of build their ministry. Like these are pillars that we should look back on. And I do think that they help structure the letters in some sense. Okay, Roman numeral 3, some significant topics in the pastoral letters. So let's talk about one that we haven't had a chance to talk about in any of Paul's other letters, and that's church structure. What are churches supposed to look like? And this is actually far more practical for you than maybe you've realized before. But the idea is that, in college here, we're all gathered together for a common reason, education, earning a degree, learning, preparation for your future career, ministry, those kind of things. There'll be a day, though, that you move on from Cedarville and you go to your geographic location where your job is, and then you're presumably going to be involved in a local church. And so here's where this becomes actually really practical. There's going to be a day that is going to come sooner than you think where you will be contributing to your local church, and they're going to need leaders. And because of the Bible Minor, you actually have an incredible set of resources that many other people just haven't had the privilege and the opportunity to take. You've been able to work through the entire Bible. You've been able to take some systematic theology courses. You've been able to have classes on how to read the Bible. And that's just the 5-course Bible Minor. I mean, for some of you might be taking extra electives and those kind of things in Bible. You're actually going to leave here with a pretty good foundation for what it means to be a good church member. Like, what does it mean to contribute to your local church? You know you've got gifts. You know the members around you have gifts. You know kind of the goals of what the church is going to be, what it should be pursuing. But now here's the question, how is it going to get there according to the leadership? You're going to be voting on leaders, depending on your denomination. You're going to probably have a voice in selecting your leaders, depending on which denomination you join. Some of you are going to be leaders in your church. Your gifting is such that, and your personality is such that you believe God is already calling you to do something like that in a local church. So how do you know if you're qualified for that? How do you know if you're ready for that? So there are issues of maturity and immaturity that are important to talk about. But then there's also just the issue of what is a qualified leader? So how about when you're sitting there and a name comes up, that maybe your pastoral board or your elder board says, hey, we'd like to recommend so-and-so to be an elder. And you're trying to think, okay, Lord, how am I a responsible congregant here and evaluate this individual so that I can cast my vote yes, or maybe I should voice some concerns here. What does that look like? Paul is giving us some help here. So first of all, we need to understand that for Paul, church leadership is done by a plurality of elders. And so when we see, in particularly our North American context here, maybe churches that are run solely under the authority of one individual, this is not really reflective in the New Testament material. Now, that's not to say that churches can't have one pastor. Please don't misunderstand the terminology here. I'm talking about the leadership and the function of a church. There may be one person who's called the pastor, but that pastor works in, within a group in making decisions and kind of setting the vision and dealing with discipline and formulating what's best for the care of that congregation. It's always done in a group of other people. There's a plurality at play here. So let's look at a couple of verses that kind of point to this. Look at chapter 5, verse 17. Paul says, let the elders, notice the plural, who rule well be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. So there's elders that rule or govern in a church, and then some of them may have the responsibility of doing teaching, right? And so because of that, they deserve a special honor. Look at chapter 4 here, going back to verse 14. Paul says, do not neglect the gift, in other words, that Timothy has, which was given you by prophecy when the council of elders laid their hands on you. So here we see that Paul is even commenting on Timothy's own kind of placement in ministry as having been done and approved by a group of elders. So what does it look like to be an elder? We need to talk about the character qualities that need to be there. Number 2, there is also a plurality of deacons that assist in managing individual churches. We don't have a whole lot of detail on deacons and what their role is. We'll look at the very few details that we do have in just a minute. But it's assumed that there's going to be more than one deacon in the church because the role of the deacon seems to be service-oriented. And so because of that, there's going to be multiple needs for service, not just one. So I personally don't know of anybody that argues for only one deacon in the church. I've never heard that as an argument, even though we don't have it explicitly stated, hey, there's going to be big groups of deacons in your church. But anyway, it's kind of an assumption that there's more than one. So let's look at the role of elders here. Let's turn to 1 Timothy 3. So verse 1, we've already looked at that. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well, with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders so that he may not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil. And then Paul moves on to deacons here. So Paul gives us he gives us numerous qualities here that an elder needs to have, but I think we can summarize them into a couple of points together. One, elders are supposed to lead the local congregation. Not to fight, right? We're not trying to overthrow the government. That would be decidedly unbiblical. They're not supposed to lead the congregation into, some other crazy plan that seems completely ungodly. My imagination is just going blank here, but I'm sure we could create some if we tried. They're supposed to lead in godliness, right? They're supposed to be models, and they're supposed to be exhorting other people, hey, follow me as I follow Jesus, right? So they're leading by the teaching of the word, which we'll talk about here in just a second. But they're supposed to be setting themselves up as a voice or a set of voices in the church, right? The elders, where they're saying, look, this is what we should be doing, and this is what we should not be doing, and kind of setting that tone in the church. So they're not passive, they're active. There are people who are able to see where we need to go and say, look, here's how we need to get there as well. So this idea of leadership. Teaching in the local body, this is not just teaching local community college courses, right? Even though that may happen in a church, that's not what we're talking about here. It's teaching specifically the scriptures. So not all the elders necessarily have to be the ones who are always teaching, but we regularly, especially in our North American context, we will have one person who's kind of designated as the pastor teacher, who does predominantly the speaking ministry in the church. But I've been a member of churches where they have a rotation. The church I attend now, we have one pastor who preaches 2 or 3 times a month, but then the other pastors will work in on that 4th week, and sometimes as the schedule permits, there'll be a little bit more flexible even rotation. And I remember a church that I attended in Indiana for a number of years. Every week they had a different person speaking, and they had a rotation of like 4 or 5 men that would just rotate in and out. They were we were near a Christian college, so it was quite easy to draw qualified Bible professors that would be doing that, right? So this is kind of an interesting facet. That may not be your background. You might be more used to just a very much continuous set of sermons from one individual. But what I'm talking here is not about the role of the elder, singular, the elders, talking about what the church needs, talking about leading them through the scriptures. And then number 3 here, be vigilant concerning false teachers. Now we're going to talk a little bit about how to know who is a false teacher, because Paul actually addresses some of the errors in teaching that he understands to be in these areas, and also the immoral behavior that they're promoting. And he says both of these together, teaching and behavior, are what kind of define or qualify as bad teaching. And elders are supposed to be on the ball on this. In other words, they're supposed to be protecting the flock from those who will come in and disrupt it. Okay, questions or comments before we move on to the next point here? I do want to take a moment just to see if you have any thoughts. I remember just a little short story. I remember when my wife's family's church, right? So it was a couple of degrees separate from my own experience, but they were deciding who, they were nominating names, I should say, for who was going to be an elder in the church. And so the church had a hockey team. And so regularly it was a men's hockey team. Regularly the men would go out and play hockey. And there was one individual's name who got put forward as a potential elder. And unfortunately, his hockey life came back to haunt him. Because every time he played hockey, he just would lose his temper and start fights. And, this was a Christian church league. You're supposed to be some kind of moderate. I mean, I know hockey has built into it a lot of violence. But this was a local church league that was not supposed to have that kind of stuff. And so what happened was he unfortunately demonstrated his real character when he was on the ice, right? And so even though maybe the perception on one day of the week came out looking a little bit better, this kind of showed and demonstrated, oh wait, this person is maybe not ready to be an elder at this time, right? There needs to be some growth. There's some character qualities here that are not thinking about others or how to handle others or how to solve problems well. And so this disqualified them for that particular moment. And I think this is what we're supposed to be understanding here for what Paul is saying, that we need to know the people, like in our congregation, so that when we do put them up as leaders or shepherds over the church, that we know them well enough to know how they're going to handle personal conflict, how they're going to handle problems, like what kind of wisdom do they have? Are they going to be able to utilize that in their management of the flock? Are they going to be able to guide us forward? Like these are the kind of things that you all need to be thinking about, even if you don't ever become an elder. These will be the list of requirements that you'll kind of hold someone to. But any comments or thoughts on that before we move forward? Yes, Abby.
I was just wondering if there's any specific scriptural basis for having one head pastor in a church, because I feel like that's generally the expectation. But I've sometimes wondered if it's less than ideal to put the burden of teaching so heavily onto one person.
Sure. Are you thinking in terms of one leader of a church or one teacher of a church, or both?
I guess both.
Okay, let me focus on the elders here. In other words, the leaders of the church. I don't think there's really much biblical merit that we can call upon to see that. When we see Paul planting churches, in Acts, he seems to be establishing groups of men to be elders there. We have letters, like 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, where Paul is supporting a corporate or a plurality of leadership that way. So it's not congregation-led, which is also maybe another issue that we could talk about. There is a group within the church that has the responsibility. The buck stops with them, so to speak, to make decisions. But it's not one person. It is a group. Now, with teaching, we may have a little bit more wiggle room there because in Ephesians 4, Paul talks about those who are given the gift of being a pastor-teacher. So this idea of shepherding and teaching. We know that you don't have to be a pastor to be a teacher, so you can have the gift of teaching and not be an elder or not be a shepherd of a church. So it seems like the gift of teaching can be elders, be non-elders, and so that creates a little bit of a distinction that way. And yet there may be, we can maybe see that Paul is talking, particularly in Ephesians 4, about having a pastor-teacher. But I don't personally think that it should be limited to that. I don't think there's any biblical merit in that argument. I'm just saying maybe here's somewhere where someone could go to get that. Yeah. seems to me like we benefit from having multiple voices in the pulpit. We also benefit from having continuity, though. I understand that as well. So people who are trained, people who have experience reading the word, wrestling with how it fits together, how to do exhortation, that proper training, I think, is really helpful. But it's also nice when you have multiple people who can fit that description and really feed the congregation that way. Yeah. What are the qualifications of the deacons and the deaconesses? Now, if we go to chapter 3 here, verse 8, I'm not going to list these out, nor am I trying to summarize them like I did the elders, but let's just read through them. Deacons likewise must be dignified, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine. So, I mean, the elders are not to be drunks, but the deacons are not to be addicted to much wine. I always find that humorous. I'm like, you could be addicted to a little bit, but not a lot. So, I don't think that's what Paul's talking about. So that's my own misreading. But not greedy for dishonest gain. They must hold the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience, and let them also be tested first. Then let them serve as deacons if they prove themselves blameless. Now, let me just pause here. We don't really know what the role of a deacon is. I mean, they do have leadership ability, but they seem to be in submission to the elder board. So in other words, it seems like as a church hierarchy, we've got elders and then deacons, right? And then through that structure, we manage any other kinds of structure that we want to have in there, whether it's committees or whether it's, small groups or any other thing. So I think there's a lot of flexibility here for different cultures to adapt this church model and still work within the church ways that are going to be very much in alignment with how they normally run things. And so when we come to deacons here, we see that really they have a lot of overlap with the qualifications of elders, right? So we may not see a whole lot of differences here. Now, verse 11 says, their wives likewise must be dignified. Now, personally, I don't think that Paul is talking about the wives of deacons. I think a better translation here is that women likewise must be dignified. In other words, I think Paul's talking about female deacons. But this is a debated issue. Not everybody is going to agree with me. One thing that's helpful here is to understand that the word woman and wife is the same in Greek. That kind of makes it a bit challenging. That's where kind of the dilemma comes in. One argument, I think, against Paul talking about deacons' wives here is that he doesn't say anything about elders' wives. So why would he kind of hold deacons to a certain standard that their wife has to meet certain qualifications for them to do their job? But he doesn't do that for elders. So it seems instead that Paul is saying deacons who are men, deacons who are women, or deaconesses. We already see the word deaconess applied to Phoebe, who delivers the letter to Rome. The church is in Rome. This is Romans 16:1. So it seems like she has the title or the function of being a deaconess in the church of Cenchrea. But once again, this is a question mark. This is a good thing for us to talk about, and we can have some wiggle room here without spitting fire all over each other, that kind of stuff, right? Verse 11, their wives or the women deaconesses likewise must be dignified, not slanderers, but sober-minded, faithful in all things. Let deacons each be the husband of one wife, managing their children and their own households well. For those who serve well as deacons gain a good standing for themselves and also great confidence in the faith that is in Christ Jesus. So once again, we don't really, I haven't taken the time to subdivide the qualifications because you can just come to this text. This really ends up being our primary text for understanding what deacons are supposed to be and do. And you'll notice that it's kind of vague, like, well, what is the role of a deacon? Well, the kind of root underneath, like the root of the Greek word deacon is to serve. And so I think that Paul has built into this just some flexibility. Like, what are the needs that the church has that the elders see, and they're like, we need to have a group of people who are going to be taking care of this. Maybe an example here is in the early church of Acts 6, where you've got this distribution of food to widows who are, they call them, they're basically Hellenized widows. They're probably Jewish widows who are coming from outside of Israel, and they speak Greek. That's kind of their demarcation. and then the Jewish widows, those who speak Hebrew. And there became this problem because the Grecian widows, the Hellenized widows, were getting overlooked in the food distribution. And so what happens? The early church, the apostles, they say, look, we don't have time to minister the word and pray and lead and take care of this. So choose for yourself people that are trustworthy, full of the Spirit, that we can entrust this task to them because it's important. And so we see Stephen most notably being brought into that, and others. All right? Before I move on there to the false teachers, or maybe we'll take a break, but before we do that, questions or thoughts on elders and deacons? Practically the point here that I want you to be aware of is that there'll be a time in the near future where you will be selecting elders and deacons in your church. And so this is the passage you want to come back to so that you can kind of filter those thoughts through, like, what am I looking for? And then there's going to be a time where some of you are going to want to be elders and deacons. And so how do you know whether this would be a good fit for you, whether your church can be benefited by this? This is another place to go. Yes?
So are elders kind of like the overseers and then deacons are the assistants? Is that how that's working?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, definitely elders and overseers, I think, are synonymous titles, where I don't think there's a difference between the two. And then deacons are, I think, delegated tasks to do by the elders. So probably this isn't like assistant in the sense of like, assistant to the what is that? Oh, never mind. Anyway, it's not like go get my coffee kind of thing, right? It's like, hey, we have a need in our church to take care of a specific issue or a specific problem or a certain area. We're going to delegate that to you all, and then you'll be accountable to us. Yeah. I want to do a shift in topic here to talk about false teaching, because all three of the letters talk about that. But any final questions or thoughts on the qualifications of elders and deacons and how that might work? Different structures are going to have different church polity, different church government. So this is understandable because notice how vague it is, right? So there's different ways of understanding how these groups work together. But I think that Paul is fairly clear that there's a group of men that are elders. They lead the church. They need to be responsible for these bulleted items. And then under that are deacons who help to serve the church by really following the direction of the elders. Yes?
Do you think that the husband of one wife thing speaks to divorce?
Yeah, good question. And I was just telling Stephanie at the break that I usually get that question. I was kind of surprised I didn't. I don't personally think Paul is addressing divorce in this passage. So, in other words, sometimes people have argued that, if a man and his wife get divorced, that he can no longer be an elder because, I guess potentially if he got remarried in particular, he would then be the husband of two wives, a divorced wife and his first wife and his second wife. I don't think Paul is really drawing attention to that because that would also eliminate those who are widowers, right? Their wife has passed away, and then if they got remarried again, then they would technically be the husband of two wives as well. And I'm not sure I know of any churches that would draw the line at that being a disqualification for being an elder. So I think what Paul is talking about here is don't have more than one wife, which I know in our culture sounds like, well, okay, that's a no-brainer. That's not going to happen unless you're in certain geographic areas, right, where maybe that's still an option. But that I do think that in the ancient world that there may have been some wiggle room to do that. And Paul's saying, nope, it's one husband, one wife. And probably this is because it's patterned off of not only the image of Christ in the church, but then going all the way back to the Garden of Eden as well. So yeah, that would be my opinion, the way I understand the text. But once again, it is a little bit vague, isn't it? And so this is why we have good people that are differing over how to understand this verse. Yeah. Good. Okay, well, let's move on to talk about false teachers. Probably the million-dollar question is, who are the false teachers, right? Well, Paul does give us some pretty clear details about what they were teaching and how they were behaving. So you'll notice that I'm pulling from multiple pastoral epistles here to define the false teachers. So who are the false teachers? First, we need to recognize that they are the ones who deviate from sound doctrine. And at least in the churches that Paul is talking about here, they get sucked into debates on genealogies and speculation and myths. So once again, that's quite vague, but apparently, and we'll see this come out a little bit in the list as well, there were those in the church that were doing their own maybe Bible study, or maybe they were exploring some Jewish literature that was written between the Testaments. I'm just throwing that out as a possibility. And they were saying, look, we could find some special meaning, or we need to really be concerned about genealogies here, and they're speculating on how different things are moving. And so they're kind of pushing some of this beyond what the biblical evidence will allow them, and they're creating dissension and division over that. Paul says, look, these are false teachers. We need to not listen to them, and you need to be, through your elders, you need to be correcting false teaching. There definitely needs to be some oversight this way. You know, it's interesting, even in our own modern culture recently, there has been a political movement that has taken on Christian language and Christian jargon to where they're actually doing baptisms at some of their rallies, maybe that would be the best term to use. And so a group of Christians have actually just recently come out and said that that group who is doing that is taking terminology from the Christian faith, and they're applying it to their own political maneuvering. And we are labeling them as false teachers. I thought, well, that's quite a strong statement. Now, I really don't know a lot of the details, so I'm kind of just shooting from the hip on the illustration, but my real purpose here is not to praise or condemn so much as to say, hey, look, even in today's day and age, we need to recognize that there are those who may or may not be Christians, right? That's not the point here. But what they are doing is that they're pushing things beyond the bounds of sound doctrine and biblical teaching, and they're using Christian terminology and even Christian symbols, in this case, baptism. So, little letter B here. The false teachers are also described as those who forbid marriage and certain kinds of food. You might say, well, that sounds really odd. Why would anybody do that? Well, if you've ever had the opportunity to study church history, you'll know that there is always, it seems like, strands of Christianity that are about don't do this. In fact, don't do anything that might be pleasurable or sensual or anything like this. And so marriage and, of course, sexual activity and eating and drinking and just kind of avoiding certain things, eating maybe a very harsh or sparse diet, lots of fasting and that kind of stuff. Once again, I'm not saying that people can't have personal opinions in these kind of things, but the false teachers were saying, hey, this is what you need to do, right, in order to follow Jesus. And so Paul calls this following liars and deceitful spirits and teachings of demons, right? These are connected together. It's kind of fascinating. Little letter C. Paul says the false teachers are those who crave, maybe in our modern terminology, we would say they crave drama. They just love to be in the thick of it. They crave controversies and quarrels over words, with the result that there is dissension, slander, evil suspicions, and constant friction. Now, I understand that some of us might say, well, I'm a contrarian in my thinking. In other words, I regularly kind of think opposite the way other people do, and we can take a little bit of pride in that. I get that. But if you find that that's your personality type, then you also need to reel it in and say, wait a minute, to be contrarian, in other words, to be someone who is thinking different just for the sake of exploring thoughts and ideas, that there are limits to that, right? And if you ever find that you're doing that and it ends up producing dissension and slander and evil suspicion, well, these are like red flags that should be going off that, wait a minute, I'm out of line here in what I'm doing here. That my proposal or discussion of this topic in the congregation is actually creating heat, but not any light. I'm doing damage. I'm not doing anything good. So I'm not saying we should check our brains at the door, please understand me. But what Paul is bringing out here is that these false teachers were pushing an agenda of teaching that was actually just stirring the pot and making things really messy. Yes?
Would you include conspiracy theories in this list?
I would, yeah. I think conspiracy theories is a great modern day example of this kind of stuff. Where, particularly up at the top, where we've got speculations and myths, So if there's someone, and I'm making this up, I have no real world story that I'm talking. If someone wants to come into the church and talk about how the moon landing was completely constructed and how, then build some kind of theology around Jesus on the basis of that, right? I don't know how you'd connect the dots, but that doesn't seem to ever be a problem for conspiracy theorists. They can do it. Then yeah, this is the kind of thing that the elders need to come in and say, no, this is not what's according to sound doctrine. We're not going to teach this or promote this. You can believe that, but that's not what's going to be promoted here at church. Letter D here, those who teach that the resurrection has already occurred. Well, this is quite specific, isn't it? Especially in light of what we just talked about in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Remember that? They were really concerned that the resurrection had already, or maybe the day of the Lord specifically had already happened, or that those who had already died were not going to have the same resurrection as them, or vice versa, right? So it is kind of interesting here that apparently this was something that had happened enough to where Paul is drawing attention to it. Denial of the resurrection, or that it had already happened, is something that is viewed as false teaching. Now we move a little bit into some behavior issues, right? So those who profess to know God, but deny him by their works. And what's interesting about this one is it's not that easy to unpack, but apparently we can understand someone who is promoting Christianity and yet then living the opposite of what at least Paul is defining as a godly person. And they're saying that that's okay. And Paul says, look, this is a form of false teaching, particularly as it encompasses, maybe marriage and food here, right? Quarreling over those kind of issues. Sorry, that's not it. Oh, here we go, letter B, abstinence and certain foods, right? Maybe that's kind of the lifestyle that is being promoted, and it's really a denial of the faith. I do think of some of the Christian cults that have sprung up, just in even living memory, right? The last maybe 50 years or so, and 100 years that we just read some of the news tabloids, and regularly there'll be something that defines the group and their cohesion, and it's based on the fact that they don't eat certain foods, they don't participate in certain kind of worship of, or honoring of days. And then often there is something that is going on sexually, right? Particularly with like maybe open marriages, or the cult leader has more, the cult leader has more benefits that way or access that way than they should. A violation of marriage is really what it is. And we've seen this enough, even in our American culture, to know that, wow, the false teaching as evidenced by that is actually easy to spot, or it's there, maybe we should say. So what are the instructions here for handling false teachers? Paul says to hand them over to Satan. Paul says to hand them over to Satan. So while you're writing that down, let me just read 1 Timothy for us here. Verse 19, Paul says, holding faith and a good conscience, by rejecting this, some have made shipwreck of their faith, among whom are Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I have handed over to Satan, that they may not learn to blaspheme, right? So this idea that here we have maybe some elders in a church, or at minimum some members, and they had, what Paul says, shipwrecked their faith. So you think about the imagery of a shipwreck, right? Maybe running aground over on some issue, some sandbar or some reef, and because of that, their ship is broken. And Paul says, look, I've handed them over to Satan. Well, what are we supposed to understand by this phrase? I wonder if what we should do is read it in light of Paul's discussion of 1 Corinthians, where we have this man, a member of the congregation, who is sleeping with his stepmom. Remember that whole situation? And Paul says, you need to remove him from the church so that he might feel isolated and separate, so that he might repent and come back, which is apparently what happened with this situation. So I think that what Paul is talking about, even with these false teachers, is that they get handed over to Satan. In other words, they get removed from the assembly so that they might repent and come back, that they might change their thinking and come back. Letter B here, elders are to rebuke those who err in false teaching. Elders are to be knowledgeable about what truth is so that they can spot error. And then they are also to protect the flock by actually publicly saying this is not what we believe, and then working forward in church discipline. Yes?
I'm sorry, this is just popping in my head, but is the 2 Corinthians passage where we kind of get the idea of church discipline, or where does that kind of get introduced?
Right, so let's go ahead and look at the 2 Corinthians 5 passage. So this particular one, if I'm remembering correctly, so I'm turning here for myself as well, is when Paul is telling them, look, when I told you to kick him out of the church, I didn't mean forever, that there needs to be an open-endedness here to the person repenting. So chapter 2, verse 5. Now, if anyone has caused pain, he has caused it not to me, but in some measure, not to put it too severely to all of you. For such a one, this punishment by the majority is enough, so you should rather turn to forgive and comfort him, or he may be overwhelmed by excessive sorrow. So I beg you to reaffirm your love for him. For this is why I wrote, that I might test you and know whether you are obedient in everything. Anyone whom you forgive, I also forgive. Indeed, what I have forgiven, if I have forgiven anything, has been for your sake and the presence of Christ, so that we would not be outwitted by Satan, for we are not ignorant of his design. So this is part 2 of church discipline, yes. So when we go to the 1 Corinthians passage, this is where we see that Paul says, look, if this person is not going to receive a rebuke and change their thinking and their behavior, then yes, you need to hand them over to Satan. So that's where he first mentions that. But then here we see part 2, that when someone actually does repent and they say, I've done wrong here, I was wrong in what I did, that doesn't mean they're permanently ostracized. We welcome them back. Is that what you were asking, or did I get off topic? Okay. Big letter E here, the need for church leaders to be consistently faithful and vigilant. Paul provides 3 metaphors that are helpful in defining the function of an elder, even beyond what we've talked about. I think in our culture, to call someone a false teacher feels a bit heavy-handed, doesn't it? Like, who am I to disagree with someone else and what they're teaching? So this is why I'm not saying we just use this label, oh, they're a false teacher, lightly, nor should we be out there just kind of broad brushing different groups who disagree with us as false teachers, as heretics. I'm not arguing for any of that. I am saying that maybe false teaching is something that is a little, a little more subtle, and we see it within our congregations according to the outworkings that it produces, dissensions, right, sedition, that kind of stuff, and these issues where people are talking not about the scriptures, but about things beyond the scriptures, and that's leading them to actually disobey the scriptures. This is probably where churches have to enter in and say, hey, we're not going to go down that road. We're going to put a stop to this. Okay, let's look at these 3 metaphors that Paul provides here. The first one is Paul gives us the metaphor of a soldier. So I'm just going to flip over to 2 Timothy here. Chapter 2, Paul says, verse 3 and 4, share in suffering as a good soldier of Christ Jesus. No soldier gets entangled in civilian pursuits, since his aim is to please the one who enlisted him. And then you'll notice the next set of verses, he's going to give us the athlete and the farmer. So what I've done for you is I've kind of unpacked what I think is Paul's main point in these metaphors. So what is it about a soldier that Timothy and the elders are supposed to emulate? Pleasing your commanding officer. In other words, as opposed to pleasing other people. So we know that when leaders are attempting to lead by merely just placating and making everybody that they're leading happy, that's not a good recipe for good leadership, right? We can see this, if we want a biblical example, we can see Saul in the Old Testament. He does that. He is disobedient to God because he fears the opinion of the people. This is not the quality or the qualifications of a good leader in the church. So this doesn't mean that an elder is supposed to constantly be doing things that are going to grate on the congregation. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying that ultimately they recognize that they are leading a group of people by following the Lord. That's what's important here. So please your commanding officer. Paul also goes on to talk about being an athlete here. You can see this in just the next couple verses. Verse 5, An athlete is not crowned. In other words, we would talk about receiving a medal, or giving a trophy, is not crowned unless he competes according to the rules. And then Paul talks about the farmer. So what is it about the athlete that Paul is bringing out? That we play by the rules of the game. And I think what Paul is getting at is that church leaders are supposed to labor by the power of the Holy Spirit. And you might say, where in the world are you getting that? Well, I'm definitely reading this in light of my understanding of all of Paul's theology here. In other words, Paul talks about not only what we're supposed to do, the ends, the goals that we're supposed to achieve, but he also talks about how we're supposed to do them. We don't do them according to the flesh or according to best business practices necessarily, or even about how our world and culture tells us to motivate people and to get them to kind of conform to what you want to do. No, we understand that we build the church of God laboring in the Spirit. It is those labors that are going to be rewarded at the judgment seat of Christ, right? This is the wood, hay, stubble versus the gold and silver, precious stones. So I think when Paul says, look, function as an athlete, play by the rules. In other words, God's equipped you to serve others with the power of the Spirit. Do that. That's the rules of the game. Walk in the Spirit. Bear fruit according to the Spirit. And recognizing that the ends, in other words, the fact that we've got a good thing that we want to accomplish, does not justify the fact that we can get there via lying or deceit or misrepresenting people or, well, there's probably a host of illustrations that we could give about how Christians have fallen into this kind of a pragmatism. Hey, I want to get the gospel to unsaved people, but I'm going to do it by manipulation and lying or something like that. Or we want to make sure that we don't have false teachers in our group, so what we're going to do is maybe marginalize people or spread rumors about them or something like that, right? There's a whole host of things that are strategies that are just bad, and I think this is what Paul is talking about. All right, number 3, Paul brings up the farmer. The farmer here. It is the hardworking farmer who ought to have the first share of the crops. Think over what I say, for the Lord will give you understanding in everything. So Paul says the farmer is to work hard and endure in the hope of produce. And I think what Paul is saying here is that elders are supposed to be investing for the future, right? Playing the long game, recognizing that growth and maturity of a congregation doesn't happen overnight, doesn't happen over several weeks, it doesn't happen over several years, it takes decades. It is the long game that we're playing. And I particularly appreciate missionaries who are planting churches in remote places where they're just laying one day upon another, teaching faithfully, modeling faithfully. A group of people that have never heard the gospel before. They're definitely playing the long game in their growth of the church over there and establishing of elders so that those elders can then grow the church as well. So when I think of farmers and playing the long game, I often think of those who are serving overseas like that.